The team outcome remains stable, but no single individual can be identified as responsible for its failure. The visible pattern is a system where work is completed, yet ownership appears absent. A common explanation points to coordination failure, suggesting that the team lacks clear communication channels. Under this view, gaps in alignment are assumed to produce scattered execution and unclear responsibility. However, even when communication improves, the same pattern persists. Tasks are still completed without clear ownership, indicating that coordination alone does not explain the outcome. Another explanation attributes the issue to workload imbalance, assuming some members are overloaded while others disengage. This framing implies uneven effort distribution as the root cause of missing accountability. Yet redistribution of workload does not eliminate the pattern. Responsibility remains diffused even when tasks are evenly assigned, revealing that effort distribution is not the primary driver. The underlying structure assigns outcomes collectively while distributing costs individually. Failure does not impose a concentrated penalty on any single actor. This creates an incentive where minimizing individual exposure becomes rational. Actors adjust by avoiding full ownership of any single task to reduce the risk of being tied to failure. As multiple actors follow this logic, responsibility becomes increasingly fragmented. Each task is partially covered, but no actor commits fully, creating a coordination surface without ownership depth. The system begins to exhibit no ownership drift as a stable pattern. Work continues, but accountability signals weaken because no single actor internalizes the outcome. What appears as a coordination issue is actually an incentive-aligned behavior. Actors are not failing to coordinate. They are responding to diluted individual cost. Attempts to assign clearer roles introduce temporary clarity, but do not change the underlying payoff structure. Actors still optimize for limited exposure, reintroducing diffusion through partial engagement. The system reinforces behaviors that distribute responsibility thinly across participants. Full ownership becomes a dominated strategy because it concentrates risk without increasing reward. A measurable distortion emerges in effort allocation. Each actor contributes enough to remain aligned with the group, but not enough to become individually accountable. This creates a surface-level completeness in task execution. However, the depth of responsibility remains shallow, preventing accountability from forming. The contrast between visible completion and absent ownership becomes persistent. The system produces outputs, yet no actor can be isolated as the source of failure. Over time, actors internalize the cost structure and adapt preemptively. They engage in shared tasks in ways that preserve participation while avoiding exposure. The equilibrium stabilizes around minimal accountability. Responsibility is collectively present but individually diluted, making ownership structurally absent. As responsibility remains pooled, short-term task completion becomes the dominant observable signal. Actors align their effort toward visible progress rather than full ownership, reinforcing surface-level contribution as the stable strategy. This shifts the system's time horizon toward immediate visibility. Longer cycle ownership tasks become underprovided because they concentrate accountability over time, increasing individual exposure. As these tasks are repeatedly deprioritized, the system accumulates unresolved dependencies. Each unresolved element increases reliance on shared handling, further diluting ownership across the group. The information structure begins to degrade as well. When responsibility is diffused, signals about who is accountable for specific outcomes become increasingly ambiguous. This ambiguity feeds back into behavior. Actors cannot accurately identify ownership boundaries, so they default to partial engagement, reinforcing diffusion as the safest strategy. A feedback loop emerges between unclear ownership signals and diluted effort allocation. As signals weaken, behavior fragments further, which in turn reduces signal clarity even more. At scale, this loop amplifies. With more actors sharing the same pooled outcome, individual visibility decreases, making full ownership even less rational. The system begins to converge on coordination without commitment. Tasks are distributed widely, but responsibility is never concentrated, locking the system into shallow execution depth. Attempts to monitor performance rely on shared outcome metrics. However, these metrics cannot isolate individual contribution, preserving the underlying incentive to avoid ownership. This creates a structural blind spot. The system can detect failure at the aggregate level, but cannot trace it back to specific actors, preventing accountability from forming. As a result, corrective actions distribute across the same pooled structure. Each actor adjusts slightly, but no one absorbs full responsibility, maintaining the diffusion equilibrium. There is a temporary tension in whether stricter monitoring could resolve the issue, yet increased observation still operates on shared outcomes, leaving individual exposure unchanged. The system therefore absorbs oversight without altering behavior. Actors remain aligned with minimizing exposure, and responsibility continues to diffuse despite higher visibility. Over repeated cycles, the cost of failure becomes normalized at the group level. Since no individual absorbs the full cost, the system tolerates persistent underperformance without triggering ownership shifts. This normalization reinforces minimal effort thresholds. Actors calibrate their contribution to remain within acceptable group performance while avoiding accountability concentration. The coordination surface becomes increasingly stable but increasingly hollow. Execution persists, yet the system loses the capacity to assign or sustain responsibility at any meaningful depth. The system no longer rewards full ownership of any single task. Instead, it rewards distributed participation that keeps individual exposure low, making partial contribution the dominant behavior. At the same time, concentrated responsibility becomes implicitly penalized. Any actor who takes full ownership absorbs a disproportionate share of failure cost, narrowing the set of rational actions away from ownership. Signals of performance shift accordingly. What gets recognized is collective completion, while gaps in responsibility remain invisible, reinforcing shallow engagement as the stable response. Compared to a system where ownership could concentrate, this structure ignores depth and prioritizes coverage. Actors adapt by spreading effort thinly across tasks, locking in minimal accountability as the only sustainable position. The equilibrium stabilizes where responsibility exists only in aggregate. No individual action can reintroduce ownership without incurring higher cost, so the system continues to reproduce diffusion as its steady state.